Shalom, ni hao, and welcome to the Understanding China podcast. This podcast will be in English, but this intro will be in Hebrew, so please bear with us. שלום ni hao, וברוכים הבאים ללהבין את סין, הערוץ שלכם לכל מה שצריך לדעת על המעצמה שתעצב את המאה ה-21. ובפרק היום אני מארח את ג'ונתן פולטון, עמית מחקר באטלנטיק קאונסל, באמת אחד הקולות הכי מעניינים, הכי רהוטים וידענים, לטעמי לפחות, בכל הקשור לסין במזרח התיכון, כותב את הניוזלטר המומלץ שמדבר על סין במזרח התיכון, China and MENA נדמה לי זה נקרא, MENA. באמת איש גם נחמד מאוד, ידען, שוחה בחומר, ואני חושב שדווקא לנו הישראלים שכל כך מתעסקים במזרח התיכון כל היום, ואני אישית שמתעסק הרבה במה סין עושה במזרח התיכון, הרבה פעמים זה ממש ממש טוב לשמוע קול דווקא של מישהו מבחוץ, אומנם יושב באבו דאבי, חי את האזור הזה כבר 20 שנה לפחות, אבל באמת מי שמסתכל מבחוץ בעין טיפה פחות אמוציונלית, טיפה פחות מושקעת, בוא נגיד ברמה הלאומית בסיפור הזה, והיו לו כמה תובנות מאוד מעניינות. לדעתי היה פרק ושיחה מאוד מעניינים, מקווה שתהנו, אני נהניתי. אז הנה מתחילים. Okay, so today I have the pleasure to host Mr. Jonathan Fulton, who's the author of the China and MENA, MENA newsletter that I find one of the most useful resources for understanding what China basically seeks to achieve in the Middle East and the different bilateral and multilateral relations. And Jonathan always writes with very good insights. Is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and based in the UAE, right? So Jonathan,
Correct.
hello and welcome.
Thanks. It's great to join you today. Appreciate it.
Are you're joining us from Abu Dhabi or Dubai?
From Abu Dhabi, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And this is where you're based in the last several years, I guess, right?
Yeah, so I moved here in 2006, expecting a 3-year contract, and then I thought I'd go back to Canada, and that shows how bad I am at predicting the future, because almost 20 years later, I'm still here.
All right. Well, it's a good place to be, especially I guess when you're tracking these topics. It's definitely closer to the action than in Canada, I
For
guess,
sure.
right?
For sure. It's a pretty great vantage point.
Yes, I agree. So Jonathan, thanks again for finding the time to join us today. I think, I had the chance to interview a few Israeli scholars and people that deal with China in the Middle East. But, as Israelis, no matter how objective we try to be, we always have our biases. And even if we don't think that we do, I think they're somehow, in the subconscious still appear. And as I mentioned in the intro, I follow what you write regularly, and I find it very insightful. So I think it would be great to get across to the Israelis some of the hot topics related to China and the Middle East. We're recording this for reference just a couple of days after the SEO summit ended in Tianjin. And although that originally was not a Middle East related forum, it seems that it's becoming also related to the Middle East in several ways. So maybe we'll touch on that. But first, before we go into specific topics, how do you see, Jonathan, China's role and its interest in the Middle East? Or maybe a better way to ask it is how China views the Middle East in its grand global strategy?
Until you get to that last word, strategy, I had an easy answer already, because I don't know if Beijing looks at the Middle East particularly in strategic terms. I think Beijing looks at the Middle East in economic terms. First and foremost, it's a place to get a lot of energy, which it does from the Gulf countries. It's a place to get a lot of money through contracting and a lot of trade. It's an important market for things like EVs, which your Israeli audience will know all too well.
Hmm.
China does a lot of business here, and I think that's the big objective. Um, I think if they do think of the Middle East in strategic terms, it's a region that matters more to other great powers than it does to China, which means it's a place where they can kind of play at geopolitics. So
Hmm.
this clearly is a place where the US is deeply invested strategically. And when China feels that they're getting hemmed in, whether it's in the South China Sea or whether China, Japan, or sorry, US and Japan or US and Korea or US, Australia, India, whatever, are coordinating more on Indo-Pacific strategy, China can activate its relationships in the Middle East, particularly with Iran, to kind of knock the US off balance. I mean, I think
Hmm.
that's kind of the extent of its strategic view of the region. I think Israel um, inadvertently played into China's strategic calculus a bit after October 7th, when China's response was largely how can it draw support from the so-called Arab street by kind of
Hmm.
looking at it as part of a global South audience that would be receptive to China's messaging about that event and its aftermath. So, I think China's been kind of looking at the Middle East politically as kind of a useful space, but I really don't see it as a priority region. I mean, Andrea Giseli, who just co-authored a really good book with Mohammed Al-Saderi, we were at a conference a few months ago, and his pithy phrase was, "The Middle East is the most important among the least important regions for Beijing,"
Hmm.
and I thought that was a good way to frame it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, it goes also with the assumption that, in the end, China see kind of like circles of importance around it, where its internal issues are the most important, then the immediate neighbors, and then as you go further, so it's
Right.
decreased in a way. And I like also this framing, it's a little bit like we hear some voices saying that, part of China's interest in Latin America is actually to kind of uh, force the US to say, oh, this Monroe Doctrine, so called, of influence for the US, China is getting the way with it. And China can say, you know what, but you're getting in the way of our things in our region. So maybe it's something along those lines. Sorry about that.
No, I think
Um,
that's right. I mean, being here in the Middle East, um, I think folks in the region naturally tend to think of this as the most important consequential region in the world.
mhm.
And why wouldn't people who are from here? Because it's just never ending conflict, competition, really life or death situations.
Yeah.
Um, and the further you get away, the less relevant it is. And China would look at its neighborhood and say, look, we've got borders with Afghanistan and Pakistan and North Korea and Russia. Like, of
Yeah.
course that's more, urgent and pressing. So, I think they look at the Middle East and think we make a lot of money there and we get a lot of oil and gas. And as long as things go well, then mashallah, let the Americans handle it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I hear you. And in that regard, is it safe to say that also when you look into China's strategic calculus, that means that again, you don't have to to refer to the word strategy, but still in a way, um, the most important countries for China are the ones that can yield the best economic opportunities. So when we look at, for example, Saudi Arabia or the UAE and Qatar, maybe the wealthiest countries in the region, they're the ones that are also most interesting for China for those reasons, or is it something beyond that, you think?
No, I think if you look at the countries China's designated as its comprehensive strategic partners, they all serve some kind of economic and political and regional and international advantage. And for the UAE and Saudi, I mean, it's obvious economically they do so much here. The UAE, the estimate from the Chinese embassy in Abu Dhabi is that there's approximately 400,000 Chinese citizens living and working here, which is
Yeah,
astronomical because we
yeah.
saw when they had to evacuate PRC nationals from Iran back in June, they said there was around 2,000. So,
Yeah,
for
yeah,
2,000 on one side of the Gulf and 400,000 in a relatively small country on the opposite side, that tells us a lot.
yeah.
So, the UAE, its status as a logistics hub is important for Saudi. It's global Islam, global energy. For Egypt, which is a country I'm sure we'll talk about, its control of
Hmm.
Suez gives it
Yeah,
an added weight. So there are countries that they look at and they think, we can get oil and gas from any number of countries. What else do we get from you? And in some of these Middle East countries, there is something extra that makes them more valuable.
yeah, absolutely. And this is why we see, the strategic investment that come from China into some of these areas are still, I think, in a way also judged by their economic merit. Maybe this is part of the reason that Iran found that so-called promise $400 billion strategic cooperation agreement to be maybe underperforming, to say the least, because that's a risky place. Whereas with Saudi Arabia, without framing it with such extravaganza, we see a lot of Chinese investments flowing in.
Well, yeah, I mean, just look at the nature of the two governments, right? In Saudi Arabia, their government is hyper focused on development and building a post hydrocarbon economy. They've got a big youth bulge. How do they find jobs for all these young people? You know, um, I wouldn't say it's a matter of regime stability, but they feel the pressure, right? Like they've staked a lot of their legitimacy on we've got answers on how to build a modern economy that's going to deliver for all you young people that want to see change. So
Hmm.
they're motivated, right, to do interesting things, to bring in different industries, to cooperate with international companies. Whereas you look at the Iranian government, like how do they manage the economy? It's just basically a corrupt mafia that
Yeah,
says, this economy is there for one purpose, to serve the regime, so we can use it to fund, our regional activities or our secret police or whatever.
yeah,
And so for Chinese state-owned enterprises or private companies, they look at Iran and think, how do we operate in that kind of an economy that's so corrupt? Which kind of sounds funny. I think a lot of people would look at the PRC and laugh at that, but really, like Chinese companies are commercial actors. They want to make
yeah,
profits, and that works in a law-abiding place where as an investor or as an employer, you've got rights. And they look at Iran and think this doesn't make any sense.
yeah,
So
exactly.
it's not a place where they're going to make a lot of money. The economy stinks. People don't have a lot of extra cash to spend. So what they do get is the cheap, low quality Chinese export goods. Whereas on
Hmm.
this side of the Gulf, they can afford the nice stuff, the good cars, the good home
Yeah.
appliances. So there's a big difference for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think in that regard, it also in a way correlates with China's wish to really move up the value chain, the global value chain, and they see, okay, some of the countries in the Middle East are maybe the right type of export markets for these Chinese cars, EVs, and so on. Whereas for the others, yeah, well, we can keep selling them the stuff that we still want to sell, but all that cheap, low cost goods that are associated with the old China in a way.
Yeah,
So
well,
yeah,
you
that's
look at what
interesting.
China's been articulating. I just published a book a couple of months ago looking at this 1+2+3
Yes.
cooperation framework, where the PRC announced in 2014 the sectors they wanted to focus on, and the three kind of breakout sectors were things like nuclear energy and space satellites and renewable energy, and all of those are high tech that kind of indicate,
Hmm.
like you say, like we don't want to be seen as a guy that make your Happy Meal toys. We want to be seen as the guys who make, your alternative to GPS. We want to be the people that you go to for really advanced tech because we've got great
Yeah.
engineers and great scientists. So yeah, you can go into markets like, Iran or Libya, where you're not going to make much money and you can sell cheap
Yeah.
stuff and you can cooperate with authoritarian states. But what they really want is to go where the money is, they can do joint ventures. They can invest in Chinese automakers, they can invest in Chinese AI, and develop pretty sustainable relationships. So, you know, you want to see where China's most active in the region, follow the money.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And in that regard, really, when we look at Iran, for example, so we talked about really some of the problems there. But if we look specifically at the security angle, there's been a lot of talk. I mean, I also heard you interview in, I think it was the China Global South podcast, where you talked about it extensively, and I recommend all our listeners to go check that interview out as well. But it's very safe to say that, let's say, the Chinese assistance to Iran during the conflict with Israel was maybe not surprising, but definitely not very effective. Let's put it this way. I mean, it was limited to diplomatic and rhetoric support, and that's about it. But we see more and more. Let's say, I don't want to call them even reports, because they seem to me like something that I haven't seen actual proper evidence for. But
Yeah.
let's call them reports for that matter, that China is going to basically resupply Iran and basically make sure that the Iranian military is able to stand up to the challenge better next time. Also trying to build off, their great PR campaign after the India-Pakistan conflict that boosted some of the image maybe of the Chinese military equipment that was used by Pakistan. How do you see that? I mean, I'm sure that Iran would want to see something like that going, but what's China's calculus when it comes to this specific topic?
Yeah, so I don't have any insight from talking to Chinese officials or any Chinese people that know. I think just my perspective from watching this for a very long time, this seems like a misinformation campaign that's got a political, motivation.
Hmm.
It seems like by saying, look, China's supporting Iran, this creates cover for certain actors to be more belligerent or active, saying we've got to do something before this Chinese missile tech comes. Because, I as you mentioned in the intro, I do a lot of work for the Atlantic Council. And I think it was in
Hmm.
2020 when the United Nations arms embargo on Iran was coming to a close. And we brought together a bunch of people who look at Russia and the Europeans and, all the actors that we think might take advantage of cooperating with Iran on certain things, and said, do you expect to see Russia or China or whoever start to increase their arms sales? And, there's an expectation that Russia would take advantage of this, because they really had nothing to lose. The cooperation with Syria,
Hmm.
it aligns with how we see Russia. But with
Yeah.
China, it just seemed like they had too much to lose, right? If they sell equipment to or give equipment to Iran that is used either defensively against the Israeli airstrikes or American airstrikes, or if it's used
Hmm.
offensively, it draws China into something it doesn't want to be part of, right? So I
Yeah.
really have a hard time imagining that's the case. Uh, you know, I just before we got on the call here, I just put out an edition of my newsletter, and one of the stories was that the Ayatollah, Khamenei, gave a
Hmm.
statement during the SCO saying we would like to see the full implementation of the comprehensive strategic partnership with China. That's something we'd
Hmm.
like to see from President Pezeshkian's trip, right? Like, let's
Yeah.
actually do this thing. That
Yeah.
is telling, right? Like they haven't
Hmm.
implemented it, and the Iranians are deeply frustrated. Like they put a lot of capital or a lot of expectations, maybe is a better word, into this thing
Hmm.
coming to fruition. Whenever we saw this number, $400 billion, that number came from the Iranian side. That there was a leaked document that the Iranians put out. Um,
Yeah.
Somebody immediately asked the Chinese spokesperson from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he said, "There's nothing quantitative in this document. Like we aren't committing to
Yeah.
any kind of numbers." So what you see is the Iranians using this relationship with China. I think like a lot of actors in the region, using China as either a wedge or as an opportunity or a hedge, or you know, I rarely feel bad for China for the PRC, but I can look at China in the region and think, wow, everybody is taking advantage of your bad messaging or taking advantage of your
Yeah.
reluctance to get involved and just using you for whatever purposes they have. And you can see Israel does it, and Iran does it, and Saudi does it, and Egypt. And I think really
Yeah.
China looks at it and says, this is why we don't want to get mixed up in this place.
Yeah. Understood. That's interesting because, this is a very, very big concern for Israel, I think. But I think it's also a major concern for other Gulf countries. If you look at Saudi Arabia or the UAE, let's say even after the so-called rapprochement that China, at least let's say, help get signing or
Posted.
push through the last mile. Yeah.
Right.
So there's not a lot of love lost between the two sides of the Gulf, and I think that they would definitely not want to see Iran being armed with sophisticated Chinese weaponry. And in that regard, is it safe to say that, uh, if it wasn't for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, maybe it was easier for China to take a side? Because in the end, it's not like they're actively attacking Israel or the US. They're supplying Iran with so-called defensive weaponry. It's almost on the borderline of something that I could see, being um, acceptable, let's say, on the diplomatic norms.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to the period when China was first getting involved in regional security issues back in the 80s during the Iran-Iraq War, when they were
Mhm.
selling weapons to both sides.
Yeah,
And, they didn't have diplomatic relations with the Saudis or Bahrain. They had just established it with the Emirates, or in process of establishing it with the Emirates and Qatar. The only two countries they had relations with were Kuwait and Oman. And Kuwait and
yeah,
Oman, Kuwaiti and Omani diplomacy was saying, look, we see you playing both sides off each other here. We want you to think long term about this. You're actually hurting your reputation, on the Khaliji side, because we're looking at you and we see a very opportunistic actor that's kind of destabilizing our region. And, around that time you saw this Saudi China kind of quiet diplomacy that never really got talked about until several years later. But that's when the Saudis went to
mhm,
China in Washington and said, "Look, we'll buy the ballistic missiles off you. We can't get them from the Americans. Um, we're definitely not getting from the Soviets. You're the only game left in
yeah,
town. We'll buy these off you." And you could see the Gulf side, the Arab side of the Gulf, using economic incentives to kind of align China more closely to their preferences of regional order. So to your point about Iran, like I don't think China would find it more natural to work with Iran, really. They're more,
mhm,
it's because this region's not that important. They look at the Emiratis and the Saudis will say, look, if Iranian oil sanctions have teeth,
yeah,
if the US is really going to force us into compliance, who has the ability to ramp up production to make up that supply that we don't have access to? And we know it's the Saudis because they did it
yeah,
back in 2018, where they increased their exports to China by a tremendous amount, like overnight. They lost six
yeah,
percent of imports from Iran, and the Saudis went, "That's nothing. We can do that in a day."
yeah,
So, there's a lot of economic incentives for China to say, "Look, Iran, you're not really worth the trouble, right? These other
yeah,
countries give us more of what we need." And I think just getting back to your part of the Middle East, like that plays out in other ways too, right? Like a lot of folks in the US especially look at things like IMEC or I2U2 or any of these things that
mhm,
have been rolled out. It often gets described as like the anti-BRI. And I think China
yeah,
looks at it and thinks, man, if there was a way to get goods from Duqm port into the Emirates, into Saudi, into Haifa, like
yeah,
that's great. Like we would love to take advantage of
yeah,
that infrastructure too, right? So if there's
yeah,
a way that they can capitalize on this kind of stability, I mean, that was the buzzword before October 7th. It was all de-escalation, right? And this
right.
idea like the Gulf and the Eastern Med could be a normal region for once.
Wow,
Let's
that sounds like
focus
a
on
dream.
development and we could create, yeah, it was a dream,
Yeah,
right?
hmm,
It was a dream that was shared, by
yeah,
Saudis and by Emiratis and by Israelis and by a lot of people.
yeah.
And I think China looked at it and thought that was a great opportunity too. So Iran is doesn't really have much to offer in a dream like that.
That's very true. And that's actually speaks to an interesting point because I remember after the Abraham Accords, the first response from China was pretty negative and almost kind of like, it caught them by surprise. But you realize that pretty shortly after, they realize, okay, there's actually opportunities and gains to be made here, and they switched to a more very classic Chinese realistic and pragmatic approach. And in many ways, that is something that they still see the Middle East in. I mean, this is their goal in the end, despite all the political gains that they could get from an ever-ending war between Israel and the region. And I mean political gains in the way that it kind of hurts the U.S. reputation, let's say. Do you think that they are interested in seeing this really resolved? It's not just empty rhetoric. They, in the end, they want the opportunities that come from peace and calm in the region.
Yeah, I don't think, because again, it doesn't benefit, you know, I should back this up a bit because I'm trying to find a way to describe China for this paper I've been thinking about.
Yeah,
It's almost like there's two Chinas in the Middle East. There's like economic China, which is all of these, SOEs and SMEs and all these businesses that are here to make money and that are, for the most part, pretty positive additions to the regional landscape. And
yeah,
then there's geopolitical China, which is really at odds with economic China, where geopolitical China seems to be doing a lot of short-term miscalculations or overcalculations that undermine its positions in certain relationships. And I think if you look at economic China, they'd say, this would be amazing
yeah.
if Israel were a normal country that had relations with its neighbors that were healthy and productive and long-term sustainable. That would be really good for business. It would make the region a lot more. It'd make the region a place where we could feel more comfortable setting up
Investing,
factories.
operating, yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely.
I do think that geopolitical China has really enjoyed raking over the US on all of its positions, which are deeply unpopular amongst most publics, if not necessarily governments around the region.
Yeah,
And it's easy points for China, right?
yeah,
It's like me playing basketball with a bunch of kindergarten kids, like
yeah,
they don't have to do anything to make America look bad in the eyes of a lot of Arabs.
yeah.
So I think they would probably enjoy that advantage as long as they could. But I think just in practical terms, it makes a lot more sense for China's interests in the region to see these political issues and security issues become phased out.
So I tend to agree with you, Jonathan. I was always looking, and I have to say, up until October 7, I think that was definitely the way I saw things. What struck me as odd, and I think it relates also to changes that we see, or I don't know if it's even changes, but something that became clear in the last few years, is that whenever maybe Xi Jinping is the first leader in China since Deng took over, that whenever economic interest and national security collide, so interesting collide, then there's not even a question. It's always national security first, even
Sure.
if it's in the expense of very important economic things. And this is why, when I saw, for example, the Houthis blockade on the Red Sea, which is basically should have hurt Chinese vessels more than anything else, or Chinese trade, let's say. Um, I didn't see, China. I could understand, of course, that they would get some back channel agreement and make sure that China would be less affected, but it still affected China as well, just by the fact that it's such a major shipping lane. And they were willing to take that hit because it seemed to me anyway that the US is taking a bigger hit. And then, it's that zero sum mentality that they always preach against was kind of in action in this case. And this is something that, to me, as an Israeli that watches China closely for 2 decades now, that was a point where I said, you know what? I'm not so sure that China's actually for the benefit of creating a peaceful, economically prosperous Middle East. If that means that the US gains from it more than China will. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, well, I mean, by bringing Xi into the calculus, you make a good point, because from Deng to Jiang to Hu, you had a very pragmatic, especially with Jiang and Hu, you had a bunch of engineers who looked at politics as, problems to tinker with and solve, right?
Yeah.
And she is the first ideological, truly deeply ideological leader we've seen in China since Mao.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of us, not only was that disturbing, but it was just like we just couldn't see that happening again. We just gotten so used to seeing China in a certain way. And the thing is,
Mhm.
I think a lot of Chinese liked that certain way a lot more than they liked the ideological. You're right. When it comes down to a matter of, the party or the economy, or ideology or the economy to be maybe a little safer,
Yeah.
he lands squarely on the ideology every single time.
Yeah.
Um, but the I think the bigger problem that he has, we've all been watching like how all these Chinese economic indicators and stats just aren't getting released. Nobody trusts them. You're hearing Chinese auto executives talking about their industry is like the next Evergrande.
Yeah.
There's serious economic problems. When I talk to people in different sectors in China, they just talk about how young people can't find jobs. And we've all heard about the laying down. And
Yeah.
that might be something that she thinks he can continue to absorb, but he's an old dude. He doesn't look very healthy.
Yeah.
You have to think, much like you can think in other states that have leaders that are making questionable decisions, that, the way that state behaves right now isn't the way they're going to behave indefinitely. And I think for most of I don't know. I mean, most of Chinese society, at least, and that includes things like Middle East expertise that I know of, they're much
Mhm.
more comfortable with this kind of economic rather than geopolitical China. So,
Yeah.
I don't know. Nobody knows, but I just think I agree to your point about how China's behavior has been inconsistent with how we've gotten used to seeing it. Um, but I think the reason China behaved the way it did for so long is because it was reasonable. It was good policy. It made strategic sense. The way it's
Yeah.
behaving now, like who in the region looks at China as a reliable actor right now?
Yeah.
Really, like,
That's true.
after their approach to the Red Sea antagonized the Saudis, that antagonized the Egyptians, that
Yeah.
antagonized the Israelis, that antagonized everybody. Everybody thought you're purely mercantilist looking out for yourself. We see exactly who you are,
Yeah.
you know. And it's interesting because the Saudi Minister of Investment was just in China last week. And
Mhm.
in the past, whenever somebody of that stature visited Beijing, what you would see is tens of billions of dollars in MOUs. This
Yeah.
time, nothing. They didn't announce it. And
Really.
I talked to a Chinese guy about this who used to be in the Ministry of Commerce, and he said they're just tired of signing meaningless MOUs with us that don't go anywhere. They don't see us the
Yeah.
way they used to see us. So,
That's very
I think
interesting.
it is. I think long term, and again, if we look at the SEO summit, you don't see any Gulf leaders there. You know,
Yeah.
Iran's president was there, Erdogan was there, the
Mhm.
prime minister of Egypt was there, but no Gulf countries had senior leaders there. And I think that tells us that's an interesting data point too.
That's definitely an interesting data point, and that's a good segue to a couple of other countries that I think are very interesting, both from the Israeli perspective, but also relating to what you just said. Uh, the Egyptians are probably the country that was affected the most by the Houthis blockade of the Red Sea.
Mm.
And although this is not something that started 2 years ago, I think it's well over a decade that there are major Chinese investments into Egypt. There seems to be a momentum recently in the relationship, and I think it's Egypt trying to have like diversify its ally network in general. We see that with Turkey and with others as well, but specifically with China, we've seen a lot of momentum in investments by Chinese companies into Egypt on very important economic project for Egypt, but also in terms of that military drill that was the one that kind of made me say, well, maybe there is something more than just the old-fashioned economic investment in this relationship now. How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, so it was interesting because last year, um, there were three major visits of Egyptian leaders to China. President Sisi went to Beijing for the China Arab States Cooperation Forum.
Hmm.
The PM was in China for the FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit,
Yeah.
and the foreign minister was there in December. And there's just so much momentum, like you say, with each of these visits, there was a lot of economic collaboration and MOUs and investments. They had called it the year of China-Egypt friendship or something. And basically what it
Hmm.
was it was a decade. It marked a decade since they'd signed their strategic cooperation agreement 2014, which no
Yeah.
coincidence is when Sisi took power, right?
Yeah.
And I think
Right.
Sisi took power with a set of assumptions about the reliability of Egypt's traditional partners. Like he
Mm.
saw how the U.S. didn't support Mubarak. He was very
Yeah.
bitter about this. There were a lot of statements with him describing the U.S. as being very duplicitous and
Yeah.
unreliable. He's been to China, I think, 8 times now in a decade.
Mm.
If you
Wow.
look at Mubarak, he had led Egypt for 30 years. I think he'd been 5 or 6 times over 30 years.
Yeah.
So on the Egyptian side, I think there's the political side that you referred to, where they're
Hmm.
trying to diversify their relationships, and they see in China a country that is willing to offer a political friendship with deep economic ties, and they think,
Right.
okay, the Americans will do the security stuff with us. We get the massive military support every year, the military aid. They don't do much for us politically, and they do very little economically. I was in
Yeah.
Cairo a couple of years ago talking to people from different sectors, and these were mostly Western trained economists or Western trained engineers. And they were complaining, they understood it, but they said, look, we can't get European or American companies to set up shop in the Suez Free Zone.
Yeah.
They're not willing to, right? They think that our economy is corrupt, or they think there's problems structurally with the economy. And these are
Yeah.
private companies that are responsive to shareholders that want to make profits.
Yeah.
And they're like, look, we're not going to go pour a lot of money into Egypt if we think that politically or economically the place is unstable. So what does that leave? I mean, Chinese SOEs, of course, are commercial actors, but they're also commercial actors that are directed by the state, and
Yeah.
sometimes they serve political agendas. So they can look at the Suez economic zone, or the free zone rather, and say we can go in there and set up automobile factories, and we can set up textile companies, and we can provide tens of thousands of jobs for Egyptians. They'll be happy. We'll make a lot of money. We'll get a strategic toehold right outside Suez, which will help us get our stuff into the Med and reach the European Union, which is our biggest market. So I think they
Yeah.
look at Egypt and think, hey, there is a vulnerable partner that needs us more than we need them. That's
Yeah.
that's pretty sweet. Let's take advantage of that as long as we can, right?
Right.
And I don't think that's a natural position. Like when I talk with Egyptians, I talk to people that did grad school in Georgetown. I'm
Hmm.
talking to a certain type, diplomats, profs, whatever. Um,
Yeah.
but there are deep educational, political, personal connections with the states. I was talking with a retired Egyptian ambassador who was very, very strong in his rebuke of the U.S.
Yeah.
But when we were talking on Zoom, he was in California, and he was staying with
Hmm.
his daughter and her family, and they're all like American passport holders that have settled in the States. And he's like, yeah, I spend 8 months a year here. It's great.
Yeah.
You know, so what you
Yeah.
find is a lot of the people in the Egyptian political class who are frustrated with their relations with the West, but they still see themselves oriented in that direction, and they just wish that they could get back to a better footing. Whereas if I say, I did an event in Cairo in 22, and my Egyptian partner, I said, bring together all of your best China watchers.
Hmm.
And there were very few, because there aren't many
Yeah.
people in Egypt who are thinking seriously about China. And I think
Yeah.
that's true of a lot of countries in the region. So when Egypt looks at China, it's kind of like looking through a smudged up lens. Like they see what they want to see, but it's not clear, right? They see a
Yeah.
country
Yeah.
that has a huge economy that's willing to invest. Um, and in terms of the military stuff, there
Yeah.
was so
Because
many rumors last
I'll just
year.
say just one thing before we go into that, because on
Sure.
the economic side, I first of all I fully agree with you. I think it was very, really spot on. I think that it's interesting to note, that in the end, Egypt is in a super strategic location, and China
Yeah.
realizes that, and for all the reasons that you've mentioned, and it seems like you touched that point. It's the difference between the people in a way, or the actual living conditions in a certain country, and what the political echelon wants and tries to achieve. And I think there's a lot of disconnect in both Egypt and the US in a way, and maybe also in China in that regard. But I think that, and then we'll go to the military stuff. I think that in a way, what we saw now with this is how I read it anyway, that when the Trump administration kind of gave a cold shoulder to this to the Sisi regime, and maybe said that maybe the aid is not so certain, and maybe we want to have you receive like 1 million people from Gaza that are not exactly the cup of tea of the Sisi regime. That maybe is something that throws the political echelons further apart in a way that says, okay, even if the Egyptians prefer, still the American lifestyle or the American culture and soft power better, in the end, we can signal to the Trump administration that this super strategic point on the geographic map that controls the Suez Canal is not really aligned with the US as something that they have to take for granted. We have other options, and this is what we want to signal. But the question is, will it actually materialize? Because at least looking from here, it seemed like the US didn't really care all that much about that signal, or at least didn't give it a lot of attention.
Well, I think that the US has gotten, I mean, I'm
Bigger
being
fish to fry?
charitable. Well, yeah, I think their aperture is a lot wider than China's aperture, right? Like they have to keep a lot of places in mind and keep a lot of countries happy. And
Mhm.
politically, they've done a pretty bad job with Egypt. But I've been to the US Embassy in Cairo and I've talked to American officials there, and I know they see Egypt as a very important partner. But I think in Washington, everybody's playing politics, and
Yeah.
Egypt is an easy place to whack around once in a while. But if you talk to people in the U.S. Army or in the DoD, like Egypt is a major strategic actor, a trusted partner. They do so much, right? And I think that's the difference between America's security relationship and a Chinese partnership. China's partnership doesn't come with any kind of commitments. It comes with let's work on areas of mutual interest. And with Egypt, maybe those interests for China would be we can try to sell you J-10 fighter aircraft, which was a big rumor,
Yeah.
last year. We saw it all the time, and it's an interesting backstory because I saw this report that Egypt was ready to buy a large number of J-10s,
Hmm.
and I looked into them, and the J-10s are very expensive.
Yeah.
And the Egyptian Air Force is already, all of their systems are geared towards certain types of jets. Like they'd have to get all new
Right.
systems in place. They'd have to train everybody. It's not just buying the jets, it's the maintenance, it's the systems, it's the training. They can't afford this stuff. And then you look at it and think, well, they get $1.3 billion in foreign military assistance from the US every year. If they started
Hmm.
letting Chinese hardware into their military, I don't think they're getting $1.3 billion from the US
Yeah.
anymore,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
So this whole story smelled really weird to me. And I asked a European diplomat who tracks this stuff to look into it. And, it was all coming from one website called
Hmm.
Bulgarian Military. Um,
Okay.
you know,
Not the
and
classic source for Egyptian military
right, yeah,
information.
where do you go for all your Egyptian military news? Bulgarian military dot blah blah blah, right? It's
Yeah.
this, and there's one guy, and I looked, the person who wrote this post had published like something like 3,000 stories last year. Um,
Okay.
you know,
Yeah.
it's a deeply unreliable. Basically, it was like a pro-Russia, misinformation farm.
Mm.
But
Okay.
he would write this stuff, and it kind of aligned with how people saw China, and it kind of aligned with the people's concerns about Egypt. So you
Yeah.
saw like
And
Chatham
then
House
that
wrote a report
military
about
drill, the
this,
joint
and
military drill that kind of really gave it substance, because I think if it wasn't for the military drill, nobody would really take this seriously. But when you saw that
right,
military drill
that definitely,
together, that was
and
like,
then there
whoa.
was, the J-10s that Pakistan had that were used in the Pakistan-India conflict, which also made
Right.
people think, wow, well, Egypt, of course, would like to get those, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Exactly.
no, are we froze? Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I see,
Oh,
I
sorry.
see you from.
Um,
Oh, okay, here we go. Yeah.
yeah, so there's this sense like it kind of seemed plausible. Um, there was other data points about the military drills. I mean, they do military drills with the Saudis and with the Emiratis and with the Iranians. They do a lot of these things. So it wasn't, especially unusual that they do it with Egypt. And again, getting back to the geography, why wouldn't you do it with Egypt if you have access to Eastern Med? They're not going to do it with Syria. They're not going to do it with
Right.
Lebanon. They're not going to do it with Israel. So, hey, this makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm deeply skeptical that there is any real security element to the relationship. Just another point that I bring back to this, if you look at most of these bilateral relationships, and especially Egypt, the state to state stuff, the business to business stuff is really,
Mm-hmm.
really meaningful and useful. But once you kind of step back and you look at what China's doing with other states,
Mm-hmm.
and you can see like it actually bumps up against Egyptian interests, like their cooperation with Ethiopia, for example,
Yeah.
um, makes big problems for Egypt. And you
Right.
can see Egyptians who will say, we're not going to be openly critical of this because we need China to invest in the Suez Free Zone, but we
Yeah.
really need them to stop supporting Ethiopia because this dam that Ethiopia is doing really screws with us. And
Yeah.
so I think that's a point that often gets lost because we tend to look at China as a series of bilateral relationships. And when you look at the big
Mm-hmm.
picture, you can see its behavior in the region isn't really consistent with a lot of those bilaterals.
Interesting. That's a very good point. Very good point. And just a last question about Egypt, maybe is what would be Egypt's interest then in holding that military drill, do you think, with China? I mean, is it really just to signal to the US or is it something more than that?
Um, I mean, I think there's a lot of signaling involved, you
Mm-hmm.
know. I don't think it's necessarily just signaling to the US, although that's certainly part of it, but I think they're also signaling to their own constituents, right? They want Egyptians who are deeply frustrated with their government's performance to, they look at it like, I think like people in China, they look at their government and think, what are you doing? Like for decades, you've been telling us go study in the West, go to the US, and now you're saying,
Yeah.
well, the US is unreliable, you know,
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
go study there, don't send your kids there, whatever. Um, so when Egyptians look at the Egyptian government and say, well, you're smack talking the US now. For decades,
Mm-hmm.
you've been telling us they're our best friend. Now you're saying that they're unreliable. Who can you work with? Like as foreign policy practitioners, what are you good at right now? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, to look at, you mentioned the crisis in Gaza. They're probably saying like, how are you doing this? Like,
Yeah.
so when you can see that your president, your prime minister, your foreign minister are going to China all the time and getting these lavish receptions, and then China sends this air force over to do joint drills, that signal also goes to Egyptians who can say, "Oh, look, our
Interesting.
government actually has a partner that respects us that enough that they're
Yeah.
willing to do this logistically very difficult um, process of getting this aircraft over here and then doing these drills with us." But I don't
Interesting.
think it comes with any kind of interoperability or any kind of meaningful
Yeah.
cooperation on this. I think it really was just let's dazzle them with a bunch of really flashy stuff.
Interesting, very interesting. And from there, maybe from Egypt to another country that Egypt is growing its relations with recently, and was actually pretty active in the last SEO. If we talked about most of the Middle East not really being presented there, Turkey, which
Yeah.
is a very interesting relationship there, I think. Turkey, I think, was pretty much maybe the only significant Muslim country to go against China's treatment of the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang and other. Uh, and that was kind of like let's say, um, an uneasy point between the Turkey and China. But first of all, we saw Turkey roll some of this criticism back, and at least not being as vocal about it. That's pretty definite. But we also saw after, Turkey trying to flex its muscles a bit with China, that in a way it seemed like it caves in to China, but actually it also managed to get a lot of deals going with China. And first we see the middle corridor that Turkey
Yeah.
is a very important part of the end station, basically, but also a lot of ideas about manufacturing EVs in Turkey and other economic collaborations. What do you think about that relationship and where it's going right now, Jonathan?
Yeah, you get whiplash looking at Turkey because Turkey, you know, is a hard partner to have. And, I say that
Yeah.
as, coming from a NATO country, like
Hmm.
Turkey can be very confounding, right? And they seem to, in foreign policy terms, um, do a
Especially
lot of
under
stuff
Erdogan,
that's,
I have to say. Yeah.
yeah, Erdogan is
Yeah.
not the most consistent foreign policy actor.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to unpack in your points there. I mean, I think the first is that, you know, there is a political limit on China Turkey. There has been for quite a while. And that you're right to point out the Uyghur situation in Xinjiang, because they are
Hmm.
ethnically a Turkic people,
Yeah.
and this has been a sticking point for Turkey. It's been a hard needle to thread because there's been this competition again under Erdogan, um, for leadership of the Sunni Muslim world. And
Yeah.
that took a really sharp turn. Um, with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi back in 2016 and the Istanbul embassy, where this slow drip of information seemed designed by the Turkish government to do maximum damage to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So a lot of Sunni countries in the region looked at Turkey, and 10 years prior to that, he was seen as a hero. And then they looked at him like, oh my God, we can't do business with you. Like
Yeah.
you're and so, I mean,
A
like
rogue
anybody, like,
state in a way. Yeah.
yeah, well, I think like every country, right? Like your foreign policy gets hijacked by domestic politics, and Turkey's domestic politics are pretty messy.
Yeah.
And in Erdogan's case, they're very personalistic. So, you often look at the things they're doing and think, how is this helping him or not helping him? So with the Uyghurs, um, it wasn't just the West that would condemn this, but other Sunni countries in the region would look at Turkey and say, "Well, look, you're the guys who think you're the big shots who are supposed to look after Muslims everywhere. These are
Mhm.
ethnic Turks. Why aren't you doing something about that?" Right? So they're kind of
Yeah.
getting it from all sides. So it's very complicated, right? Like with China, you could see that they wanted to enhance relations,
Mhm.
especially when China, Costco took over Piraeus port in Greece,
Yeah.
and you could see
Yeah.
all this Chinese money flowing into Greece right across the way. And the Turks were like, well, man,
What
we
are you
link up
doing?
a lot better than Greece does. Like, why aren't you building
Yeah.
stuff here? So I think they both kind of kept each other at arm's length for these political issues. For China knew that Turkey would have to speak up occasionally about
Hmm.
the Uyghurs. Um, Turkey knew that it was going to antagonize China occasionally when they did, and it just kind of put a ceiling on what they were willing or able to do. But in terms of SCO, Erdogan's always made it clear that he sees Turkey like we should be part of this, right? We
Yeah.
are much more closely. We should be a full partner, not a dialogue partner or observer. We
Yeah.
should be like at the big boy table.
Yeah.
I should be sitting with Putin and Modi and Xi, and have that
Yeah.
status. And he's made this point almost every year that they have a summit.
Right.
Um, so he clearly sees that as something that he wants. But I imagine the Turkish military looks at it as something they definitely don't want because, again, they're in NATO.
Yeah.
And that's a
That's
very important relationship for Turkey, right? Like that
right.
gives them a whole lot more status and a whole lot more prestige and real power. than
Then
the SEO, which is just a talk shop. Like nothing comes from being an SEO member except you get to go make a speech once a year. Like
yeah,
there's no real tangible benefits at this point. Maybe
yeah.
there will be someday, but they're not now.
Yeah, they're
So
trying to push that narrative now that we're going beyond talk now. You saw that in the last, but definitely right
right.
now it's and even if they will, it's definitely not as prestigious as NATO and NATO status is. That's for sure.
If they go beyond talk, what is it going to look like? Because at the end of the day, you've got China as a full member, and you've got India as a full member.
Yeah,
And
right.
despite the current, Trump-inspired closeness, where
Yeah,
Xi and Modi shook hands and said we're partners, not rivals. We all know that's not at all the
not the
case. That
case.
India
Yeah,
and China have no trust, no love lost, and as
yeah,
soon as things get normal between India and China, or sorry, India and the US, they're just going to turn around and India, China's going to be bad again. So
yeah,
the SEO has serious limitations
for
on its
sure.
ability to be more than a talk shop. Um, so yeah, I think
But
with Turkey, I mean that's weird. But then just to get back to some of your other points about things like the auto manufacturing and the investment. And the middle corridor is the big one. The middle
yeah,
corridor is a seriously important part of this puzzle that didn't really exist prior to a month or so ago. I mean, we
hmm
all talked about the middle corridor, but there was still this conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and
yeah,
other issues that hurt the linkages that would connect Turkey to this stuff. And with some of that stuff off the table, you can see a real opportunity for China to take advantage of this. I don't think overland connectivity is the story for China. Like it's all maritime
yeah.
maritime is everything. But of course, you want other means of connecting supply chains and markets. And the middle corridor is going to give Turkey a status that it didn't really have even a few months ago. And I wouldn't be surprised. I think next year is some landmark like 70 years of diplomatic ties between
Mm,
Turkey and China. I think it's 70. I'm not
yeah,
sure. It's a round number, whatever it is. It's
yeah.
probably going to result in China or Turkey being elevated to a comprehensive strategic partner. That's what I'm putting my money
Interesting.
on.
Interesting, interesting. And that, ties also to the general rise of Turkey in the Middle East power plays, that we saw in Syria and elsewhere. Maybe that's also something in consideration for China, where they see, what, this is actually maybe a more important player for us in terms of shaping the power dynamics in the Middle East than definitely
Yeah,
Iran and maybe others.
maybe. I tend to look at it as a series of rise and fall, because I've just seen so many of these cycles where Turkey just can't seem to get out of its own way in the Middle East.
All right. So, Jonathan, before we finish, and I want to be say again, thank you. You've been very generous with your time. Um, Couple of last questions, and maybe we can tie them together even. Uh, when we see the Trump administration being, let's say, less consistent in a way in terms of its policy in the Middle East, we see specific areas, specific initiatives that get a lot of focus, like we saw that trip to Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE. But on the other hand, we see less attention to countries like Egypt. Do you see China basically trying to figure out where the vacuum is and just fill that in, basically, wherever the US will not be, we will fill that vacuum? And as a connected question, for Israel, which after October 7 is, it was very clear even before, but now I think there's nobody that would doubt it, that Israel is obviously very much tied to the US status in the region. Uh, how does China trying to fill that vacuum affects Israel's calculation from your perspective?
Okay, well, first, I mean, I think the vacuum angle, I reject that, because the countries that China's the closest to tend to be very closely connected to the US.
Yeah,
Like they do a lot with the Saudis, they do a lot with the Emiratis, they do a lot with Egypt, and those are all really important relationships for the states. I think that US relationship confers a degree of stability and prosperity that makes it desirable for Chinese government and businesses to work there. So
Yeah.
I think they're quite satisfied with that. I think um, one thing maybe we didn't talk about when we were talking about Egypt was you look at specific markets that China's being kept out of. Like I'm thinking when G42 and Microsoft made
Hmm.
that AI deal,
Yeah.
which excluded, came with the condition that you've got to get the Huawei stuff out of your networks.
Yeah.
Um, I think at that point, China thought, okay, this stuff is important to us, being kind of big in this telecoms and AI. Which
Hmm.
countries need it? And we're going to go there in a big way. And I think they saw Egypt
Yeah.
and they're like, hey, like they can't afford Microsoft, right? They
Yeah.
can't afford BlackRock. They can afford Huawei. So
Yeah.
I think they looked at it in kind of a pragmatic market-based perspective and thought, that's somebody we're not likely going to lose unless the U.S. government is willing to massively subsidize American
Right.
tech. So I think what they do is they look for those kind of advantages where they can get in and not necessarily make a wedge against the U.S. or its businesses, but just where the competition is going to be a lot easier for China to get into. Now,
Yeah.
what it means for Israel, I think, is interesting because even up until like October 6th, 2023, there was
Hmm.
always this kind of narrative of Israel and China doing a lot in the tech space. And I remember, I mean, I haven't been back to Israel since 22. Um,
Yeah.
but I talked to a lot of people in the tech sectors in Israel back then, and they were saying, look, we kind of stepped back from Chinese tech a long time
Yeah.
ago. And there were a number of smart reasons. Like one was you could see 2017 when, there was the innovative comprehensive partnership and everybody
Yep.
was talking about all the stuff that was going to happen. That was also coincidentally the year that the U.S. released its national security doctrine that said, China's our
Exactly.
chief competitor. And I think
Right.
in Israel, probably the strategic class talked to the tech class and said, the U.S. is everything to our long-term security, and China doesn't really offer much of anything in that space.
I agree. And you know what?
So
I'll just say, Jonathan, I've been personally involved in a lot of these things because my background is from the tech sector. And
okay,
you could see the private sector implementing this way before the government did. It was
yeah,
kind of like they understanding where things are going and say, you know what, great that you signed this thing, but we understand where Washington is heading and we know where our market and where our partnerships really are. And that
totally.
was very clear. Yeah.
Well, it was interesting because talking to private sector actors in the technology sphere,
Hmm.
they would say things like, look, when China goes to Egypt or they go to, a lot of Arab countries, it's a buyer seller dynamic.
Yeah.
They are the tech producers going to markets to sell this stuff.
Yeah.
Israel is a competitor. Israel is also a producer. So a
Yeah.
lot of Israeli companies were saying, we're worried about our IP,
Yeah.
cooperating with China.
Yeah.
Or I think even more long term, our most important partnerships could be in the UK, the EU, the US, Canada.
Yeah.
Um, those countries have been burned by Chinese tech in a big way
Exactly.
consistently. And if we, as an Israeli firm, go to Germany or go to Canada and say, "Hey, let's do business," and they look at our books and see that we're doing all the stuff with China, then it's going to be really hard for us to cooperate with them. So they
Yeah.
said they divested themselves of China long before that. So I really think, like to your point, I think Israel. We all know Israel made its choice. Everybody in China knows Israel made its choice.
Yeah.
What that means for Israel is that you make a perfect, you know, thing for China to use politically whenever they need
Yeah.
to, because they don't get anything out of you, right? Except
And not
uh
anything important or strategic, let's put it this way. Yeah. They can
right,
sell
some
EVs
trade,
there and
EVs.
make it a case. Yeah. A
They'll be
case
happy
study.
to sell EVs to you,
Yeah.
but they know at the end of the day that, Israelis don't really think about China in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
And if they do, it's not particularly positive. So for them, it's pure geopolitics.
Yeah. And it's a self enforcing kind of mechanism because even when the tech sector realized who its partners are, the public opinion in Israel before October 7th towards China was one of the most favorable in the West. And I think after
Sure.
October 7, you saw a dramatic drop in that, and I think it's in a point where it's a very tough spot right now. But Jonathan, I want to thank you again very much for your time. You've been very generous, very insightful, as I knew you would be. So thanks a lot again for all the insights and for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Fun conversation. I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Have a good one.
Okay, take care. You too.
Thank you.